Have you ever cringed when hearing about or thinking about or maybe even experiencing well-meaning Christ followers trying to point people to Jesus, but in a poor or awkward or even damaging ways? Decades ago, the whole fire and brimstone type of preaching was very popular. This was a strategy focusing on hell and God's judgment and fear. Essentially, it was a strategy to scare people into accepting Jesus into their life. Now, not only did that type of teaching come from up on the platform, but it came from pamphlets as well. Christ followers would hand out on the streets these turn or burn tracts with graphic imagery of hell and eye-catching slogans. But perhaps instead of handing out a tract, maybe you've seen some Christ followers try to be a little more tactful in their approach. Perhaps they've tried to find any way to bring up this topic in conversation. Things like, is it just me or is it hot in here? Speaking of heat, let me tell you about hell. There have been these fear-driven methods of evangelism where well-meaning Christ followers try to push people towards Jesus by scaring them. There's also been guilt-driven methods of evangelism where well-meaning followers of Jesus try to push people towards Jesus by shaming them. There's even been sales pitch methods of evangelism as Christ followers try to push people towards Jesus by manipulation. Now, here's the thing. Christianity claims to know the only way to access God. Christianity claims to know the only way to experience life and life to the full. Christianity claims to have all the answers to life's purpose and eternal security. And if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you believe these claims. If you are a Christ follower, you are convinced that following Jesus is not only the right way to live, but the only way to truly live. And if you are a follower of Jesus, you should be motivated to tell people about the good news that you believe. But the question is this: how do we do this without coming across as weird? How do we do this without coming across as pushy? Or how do we do this without pushing people away? How do we do this without coming across as a fearmonger or a guilt tripper or a salesperson? Well, that's exactly what we're going to discuss today, because that's a question that you asked for. Before we answer that question directly, I want to introduce you to the Engel scale, which is on your outline. The Engel scale was developed by James Engel, who was a Christian researcher and professor, and he created it to help churches and missionaries understand where someone might be on their spiritual journey and how to support them at each stage. I have found this scale incredibly helpful. The people who you are trying to talk to about Jesus land somewhere on this scale. In fact, if you don't consider yourself a follower of Jesus, you land somewhere on this scale. These people who have not followed Christ yet are somewhere between being unaware that God even exists and at the point where they're ready to make a decision to follow Jesus. This is important to think through, because you will have vastly different types of conversations with individuals depending on what stage of their spiritual journey that they're on. Where they are on this scale will influence how you approach spiritual conversations. For example, to someone who's at stage -9, I might begin a conversation with them about discussing the vastness or complexity of our universe. I might try to point them to the conclusion that behind this intelligent design of our universe is a mind. This didn't just happen by random chance. And that mind, I believe, is the God of the Bible. I mean, they may believe in a supreme being, and my goal would be to help them understand that why that supreme being is God. Now, here's the interesting part of the scale. Sometimes it takes an individual's decades to move from -8 to, say, -3. And sometimes it just takes one conversation. Regardless, the role of a Christ follower is relatively simple. Our role is to plant seeds and to help people move farther along in their faith journey. And you need to share about Jesus differently depending on the stage that that person is in. Okay, so back to the question of the day. How do I talk to Jesus without sounding weird? Well, I want to share with you 5 everyday ways to point people towards Jesus and lovingly engage people at these different stages of their journey. And now we're going to talk about what specifically to say, but before we do that, I want to challenge you to have a lifestyle of evangelism. I want to introduce to you a great framework to have a lifestyle of evangelism. I want to introduce to you what I'm calling the BLESS acronym, and it's actually inspired by this book. It's a great book. If you want to dive deeper into what we're talking today, purchase this book on Amazon and read it for yourself. The first B in the BLESS acronym is this: you need to begin with prayer. You need to lean on God. This is about having the mindset and the posture that says, God, who do you want me to bless today? It's quite simple. Start by praying for people who don't yet know Jesus and ask God to guide your heart and give you opportunities. When you pray this way, it's kind of like turning on your spiritual GPS. You won't know where to go or who to help without asking the guide first. Prayer helps you tune into God's directions. Now, how do I do this? Well, the first thing is pray for specific people by name. Take a few moments every day, pray for them by name. If you don't have a list of people that you're praying for by name every day, make that list right now. Keep it on your phone or in your wallet or somewhere visible where you can see. Pray for people by name. Secondly, ask God for divine appointments. Meaning, ask God something like this every day. God, place someone in my path today. Point me to someone today. Give me a God divine appointment today. And then simply listen and act. A number of months ago, my dad was praying for a certain individual. And one night he had a vivid dream where he felt like God was telling him to go and speak to that individual the next day. As my dad explains the story, when he woke up that morning, he was so convinced that God was asking him to speak to that individual that he gave him a phone call and he went over there that morning to share about Jesus Christ. Now, the individual, he respectfully listened and asked some questions, and then my dad went home after an hour or so. 3 weeks later, that man passed away. Now, we're not sure if he made a decision to follow Jesus before he passed. But what we do know is that God clearly led my dad to speak to that individual. My dad was able to plant a seed. And that's what happens when we pray. God can give us these divine appointments. He can open these doors that only He can open. And our role is simple after that. We just listen and we act. Now, the next two, the L and the E in the BLESS acronym, are essential when speaking to people on the lower end of the angle scale, meaning those who are farther from making the decision to follow Jesus. The L stands for listen. You need to learn their story. Stephen Covey says, seek first to understand and then to be understood. The challenge is to take time to genuinely listen to others and what they care about and what they're struggling with and what brings them joy. Learn their story. Have you ever had a friend who got into selling for a pyramid scheme? I mean, I've heard many stories where suddenly that friend no longer saw you as a friend, rather they saw you as a potential client. And once that happens, you begin to question every interaction you have with them. You're thinking, well, do you actually care for me? Do you actually want to hang out with me, or are you just trying to sell me something? Am I your friend here, or am I your client here? Listen, you are not trying to sell Jesus to your friend. Yes, you have this deep conviction to tell them about the good news of Jesus Christ, but people are not projects. And as Christ followers, we must not give the impression that they are. So you have to genuinely care for people. That means in conversation, listen. And listening is like digging for treasure. You're patiently uncovering the deep stuff that matters to them. And rather than just waiting to speak, learn their story. Be curious. Don't be preachy. Third, the E in the BLESS acronym stands for eat together. Share life together. Why? Because sharing a meal breaks down walls and builds up relationships. Your words will mean more if you have a relationship with that person. So spend time over food. It's one of the best ways to deepen friendships. In fact, Jesus did this all the time. Jesus spent an excessive amount of time eating with people who were far from God. I mean, when you read the story of his life, this was a major theme in his life and in his ministry, and it should be a theme in yours as well. It's because food has this amazing ability to break down walls and open hearts. Eating with someone, it's like opening up the front door of your life. It turns strangers into neighbors and neighbors into friends. Eat together. And the beautiful thing about spending time together is that people can then see how you live differently. They can see how God has impacted your life, and hopefully they will notice. Hopefully that will lead to conversation. Now, saying that, you can't just stop there. Sometimes Christ followers can convince themselves that this is enough to reach someone. I'm living a good lifestyle, but just living it isn't enough. We then need to move to action as well, which leads me to the letter S in the BLESS acronym. Here's where we begin to turn the conversation to be about Jesus. The S stands for share your story. You need to get personal. When the time is right, talk about what Jesus means to you. Well, how do I do this? Well, think of sharing your story and the next S in the BLESS acronym, which we'll get to in a moment, kind of like flying a plane. When you fly a plane, the first step is to actually take off. I liken sharing your story to taking off. You're launching a conversation about Jesus. And so when you share your story, you can answer these questions. It's fairly simple. What was your life like before Jesus? Then what led you to Jesus? And what is your life like now after Jesus? Now, this may sound a little bit elementary if you've been going to church for a while, but make no mistake about it. This is not an easy conversation to master. You actually need to carefully and thoughtfully and strategically think through what you're going to say. You need to take time to ponder these questions deeply and figure out how you can best share them in a way that does not come across as preachy or cliche. Let me give you a very short sample of my story. I grew up in a Christian home, but as I look back, my faith wasn't my own. It was actually my parents' faith. I went to church, and to be honest with you, I hated it. I knew about God, I knew all the Bible stories, but he wasn't really real to me. I wasn't really following God. I was listening to my parents who were following God. I mean, that was my life before Jesus. But then when I was in grade 11, I went on this missions trip where we did some aid work in Guatemala. Now, I cannot tell you exactly what happened on that trip or a moment that changed everything. But when I came back home from that trip, it was like I had this Bunsen burner lit under my walk with Christ. I mean, I could not put down my Bible. I began pursuing attending church and pursuing friends with similar passions. I felt like my words and my actions, my entire lifestyle was being transformed drastically over the next couple years, and it continues to be transformed even to this day. it was on that trip that I placed Jesus Christ at the center of my life. I mean, that's what led me to Jesus. And since then, I've been on this journey. Since then, my head has caught up to my experience. I've realized over the years that there's actually rational, historical evidence that I believe proves Christianity to be true. And Christianity, it's given me a framework for life. It's given me an answer to who created this complex world that we live in. It's given me a way to think and make sense of the bad things that happen in life. Christianity has also shaped my thinking about what happens after we die. To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure how people without this framework make sense of our world or have any sense of ultimate meaning and purpose. That's what my life is like now. Now, as you listen to a bit of my story, did you notice how many jumping off points there were in my story? Meaning, there were many places where the person that I'm sharing this with can ask questions, and there were concepts that I know are intriguing to talk about. My hope is that the person will ask about some of these things. Ask questions like, what do you mean that there's rational historical evidence of Christianity? What answers has Christianity given you about the bad things that happen in life? What type of purpose has Christianity given you? And once those types of questions are asked, now you can have a great conversation about life and faith. But again, you need to take time to deeply think about these questions and figure out how best you can share them in a way that does not come across as preachy and cliche. And you then need to know how to answer some of the tough questions that might come your way. And I'll speak about that in a moment. But continuing with this plane analogy, we've now taken off and now we are in mid-flight. And when you're in mid-flight, you could then share God's story, meaning you get to the gospel. Now, God's story is often referred to as the gospel, and the word gospel literally means good news. Now, I want to share the gospel message with you using those very letters as another acronym. And these are the core truths of the Bible. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ and you've been so for a while, you've probably heard these things a million times. But again, do not tune me out. You may know the gospel story, but that's not my question. My question is, do you know how to explain the gospel story to someone who's asking about it? That's your challenge. You not only need to know the gospel, but you need to know how to be able to share it with someone in a way that actually makes sense and that's actually intriguing. So instead of tuning me out, ask yourself, how would I share this with a friend or a coworker or a family member in an understandable or interesting way? And every time you share about these, it'll sound a little bit different because every person you share it with is different. So here's the gospel message. It begins with your purpose. God created us to be with Him. I mean, we say this a lot at Broadway Church. We say, why were you created? Well, you were created to experience and express the purest love imaginable. You were created to experience and express God's love in your life. If anyone ever asks me why I follow Jesus Christ, I start with this. It's because I believe that every person was created to experience God's love and then in turn express it to others. And if you are not experiencing God's love, you are not experiencing life the way that it was meant to be lived. But we have a problem. And our problem is this: our sin separates us from God. Now, what is sin? Well, sin is the things that we do wrong, but it's actually much more than just our wrongdoing. I love how the late Tim Keller defines sin. He says, sin is building your identity, your self-worth, your happiness on anything other than God. So sin is building your life on anything else other than God as the foundation. And because God is perfect, our sin separates us from God. And sin cannot be removed by good deeds. The reality is, you and I were helpless because of our sin. We cannot deal with our sin problem on our own. There's no number of good deeds or any amount of money that we can pay to get rid of our sin, to bridge this gap. That's not how it works. We needed a human being that had the moral purity and infinite value of God to deal with our sin problem. So, paying the price for sin, Jesus died and then he rose again. And so that everyone who trusts in Jesus alone has eternal life. If you put your faith in Jesus, if you believe what he believed, you have eternal life in him. And now, your life with Jesus, it starts now and it will last forever. It's beautiful. Again, if you're a Christ follower, you may be thinking, yeah, Lewis, listen, I know all this stuff. It's elementary. That is not my question. My question is not, do you know this stuff? My question is, can you explain it to someone in a way that actually makes sense? I love this quote that's often attributed to the famous boxer Mike Tyson. The quote reads, "Everyone has a game plan until they get punched in the mouth." I learned this harsh reality after I led someone to Christ for the very first time. I was 18 years old, and I remember this young adult had come to church, and she became a follower of Jesus Christ, and I was sitting with her I remember we were sitting at the McDonald's in Guilford outside on the patio eating ice cream. And we were reading the Bible together. I was showing her how to read the Bible, and I was fumbling through and trying to explain how it all works. And she was reading a portion of the New Testament, and I was eating my ice cream. I always get ice cream in a bowl. That's why I'm eating it like that. And she came across this word that's on the screen. And I wasn't looking at what she was reading, and I remember hearing her sound it out like this. Pharisee. Pharisee. And I said, "What are you reading there?" And I looked at the word. "Oh, you mean Pharisee?" She said, "Yeah. What is that?" I said, "Oh, well, let me see. Where do I begin here?" Well, they were the Jewish leaders who always kind of seemed to be against Jesus, who was also a Jewish person. And I'm not quite sure exactly how the Pharisees got there, but I do know that they came up a lot when you read the Gospels. Oh, the Gospels. Those are the biographies of Jesus, and there's 4 of them that we have in the New Testament of the Bible. Oh, and you should know that the Bible is actually split into 2 parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament was before Jesus was born, and the New Testament was after Jesus was born. Wait, sorry. What was your question again? Listen, everyone has a game plan until they get punched in the mouth. My point is this. You may think you can explain the gospel to someone until you actually have to. My challenge to you is to take these main points, this gospel acronym that I've provided today, and practice explaining it in a way that actually makes sense. You need to deeply think about these points and how to describe them to someone. And you need to think through potential questions that may come your way. And in order to do that, you have to actually understand these biblical concepts. And so there's some homework for you to do. And just like any flight that's in the air, you may experience turbulence. Turbulence in this context would be pushback or questions asked of you that you don't really know the answer to. And if you're encountering significant pushback in a conversation, a strategy that I use is to go back to the L in this acronym, to go back to listen. Go back to listening their heart, listening to their story. And this can happen only when you ask a lot of questions to hear where they're coming from. "Oh, I see that you disagree with me on this point. Tell me more about that. Why do you feel that way? Oh, you're not convinced that what I'm saying is the truth. What's your perspective on this?" I've realized that you're probably not going to argue someone into becoming a follower of Jesus Christ. So ask questions, and if need be, ease off and go back into building into the relationship. Saying that, if a question is asked that you don't know the answer to, the best answer that you can give in that moment is, "That is a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. Let me get back to you." Then do your research and get back to them. In fact, some great resources that I've used many times over the years are these ones that I'm going to share with you. Our skeptic course that you can scan the QR code and it'll go to our website. We answer questions like what's the evidence for the existence of God? Why is there suffering and evil? Why would a loving God create hell? In fact, we're launching this course again in the new year, but you could also find the videos on the media section of our website, again, by scanning the QR code. Dr. Frank Turek, he's a Christian apologist. An apologist is someone who defends the Christian faith. He's got a great YouTube page where you can watch his debates in universities, and he's got some other great content. I highly recommend it. Another website I often use is gotquestions.org. Now, no website is perfect, but I found this one incredibly helpful over the years. One final resource is our Alpha course. Alpha, it's a world-famous course that asks and answers life's biggest questions. We're launching this course in September, and I would challenge you to prayerfully consider inviting someone to Alpha and sitting right beside them during the course. But not only is this course great for those exploring Christianity, it's actually great for Christ followers to take to understand the gospel better. You can take this course in order to better understand some of these concepts that I'm talking about today. And when questions come up, you can share some of these links or invite them to a course, do your homework, and get back to them with an answer. But then you need to land the plane. That means you need to, at some point, invite that individual to respond and take the next steps. Now, admittedly, this can feel very intimidating. You may feel ill-equipped to do this. You may not feel ready enough. You may not feel like you know enough. And if you feel that way, you need to know that you will never feel ready enough. You just need to do it. So when you feel like it's an appropriate time or the right time, you can ask if they want to make a decision to follow Jesus today and pray with them. Perhaps you're thinking, "Well, Lewis, I don't know what to say. How am I supposed to do that?" If I heard that excuse from a Broadway church attendee, to be honest with you, I'd first be tempted to give a passive-aggressive response. Something like, "Well, we do say that prayer every single service here at Broadway Church, and perhaps if you had been paying attention, you would know what to say." After being tempted to make you feel bad for not paying attention at church, I would simply say, "Listen, it's a simple prayer inviting Jesus into their lives. There's no need to overthink it." In fact, I'll show you how to do that in a moment as I close, as I'm going to lead those of you who want to make that decision today in a prayer. But first, let's get to today's big idea. When speaking to people about Jesus, you need passion mixed with preparation and a lot of prayer. That sums up today's teaching. When you talk about Jesus, you need passion and preparation and prayer. There's a certain amount of passion that you need to be bold enough and motivated enough to share about Jesus. But you can't just go and wing it. You need a plan. You need to think it through. You need to be prepared. You need to think where on the angle scale this person may be. You need to walk through the different bless strategies. You need to think through the best way to share the gospel message. You need to put in the work. And then, of course, it all needs to be covered in prayer, because ultimately it's God who draws people to himself. It's ultimately God who softens a heart. And so today, perhaps you're here and you're listening, and something deep inside you has kind of been triggered. Maybe you're here today and you want to make a decision to follow Jesus Christ. Maybe you're on that journey, you're on that angle scale, but today God is speaking to you, and you feel like today you want to invite Jesus into your life and you want to live for him. If that's you, I want to lead you in a simple prayer. So simply bow your heads and agree with me as I pray on your behalf. God, I want to turn from my old ways. I want to turn from my old ways and I want to turn towards you. I thank you for sending your son Jesus to die for me. I want to accept his forgiveness and the grace that you are offering me. And I want to start my life with you today. I want to place you at the center of my life, and I want to live for you forever. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you made that decision to follow Jesus Christ today, the best advice that I can give you is to scan the QR code on the screen and let us know about this decision. Or you can click the first link in the description. We have a pastor on the other end. We would love to help you in your next steps of following Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us. We will see you all next week.